Is it wrong to steal? You probably believe that we should not steal, but why should you believe that? Maybe it's because we should promote justice, but why should you believe that? Maybe because we should be kind to others, but why believe that? We can keep asking why, but let's stop here. What you're looking at is a justification chain, a chain of reasons. As humans, we feel the need to justify what we believe. We want our worldview to be built on a solid structure instead of random guesses. So, it's important to justify our beliefs. It's important to know why we should believe this instead of that. However, should our justification chain end at some point, or should it go on forever? That is the regress problem, and both options seem problematic. If the justification chain ends at some point, then why should it end there instead of elsewhere? But if the justification chain goes on forever, then how can your belief be well justified if its justification status depends on the justification status of another belief, which depends on the justification status of another belief, and so on forever? For example, if it's the case that A is true if B is true, and B is true if C is true, and so on forever, then how can you ever know that any of these beliefs are true? If there is no adequate solution to the regress problem, then we have no ultimate basis for distinguishing good justifications from bad ones. In that case, we have no ultimate basis for claiming that the belief we should not steal is better justified than the belief we should steal. In this video, I'll offer a step-by-step analysis of the regress problem, and then I'll try to solve it. The regress problem is a general philosophical problem, but we'll focus on normative beliefs because this video is part of a series on politics and ethics. Section 2. Setting the stage. I said that I will offer a step-by-step analysis of the regress problem. So before we talk about the problem and how to solve it, we need to go over some definitions and propositions that are foundational. I divided them into 3 groups so we can set the stage piece by piece. Definition 1. Description. A description is a proposition that says how things are or how things are not. For instance, some people like chocolate, all dogs are animals, and unicorns do not exist. Definition 2. Norm. A norm is a proposition that says how things should be or how things should not be. For instance, we should promote peace, no one should be homeless, and there should be no injustice. Note that the word should is not the only way to express norms. Instead of saying that A should occur or that A should not occur, we can say that A is permitted, A is not permitted, A is obligatory, or A is optional. For instance, we can say that drinking tea is permitted or that murdering someone is not permitted. We could also say that being logical is obligatory, which means that being logical is permitted and not being logical is not permitted. Or we might say that drinking coffee is optional, which means that drinking coffee is permitted and not drinking coffee is also permitted. In all these cases, we are expressing norms even when we don't use the word should. Definition 3. Set. A set is a collection of things. For instance, blue, red, green is a set of colors. I'll use braces to signify a set, like this. So, set 1 contains Socrates, a Greek philosopher, and set 2 contains Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, 3 Greek philosophers. Definition 4. Set of norms. A set of norms is a collection of norms that contains at least one norm. For instance, set of norms 1, which contains the norm no one should be homeless, and set of norms 2, which contains the norms there should be peace and all humans should be logical. Now let's go over 3 propositions. Proposition 1. There are many norms. Here's a list of 6 norms. There are many other norms. There can be general norms like there should be no war, and there can be specific norms like there should be no war between Russia and Ukraine. There can be positive norms like we should promote peace, and there can be negative norms like we should not promote war. These are some examples of norms, and we can identify many others. So, proposition 1 is true. There are many norms. Proposition 2. You accept many norms. It would be easier to prove this proposition if I talked to you directly, but I can't do that in a YouTube video, so I will make 3 general remarks. First, I assume that you have many ideas about what an ideal world would look like. For instance, maybe you believe that in an ideal world, no one is homeless, so you believe that no one should be homeless. Or maybe you believe that in an ideal world, there is no crime, so you believe that there should be no crime. Therefore, if it's true that you have many ideas about what an ideal world would look like, then it's true that you accept many norms. In addition, I assume that you have a lot to say about ethical and political issues. For instance, maybe you think that the government should not prevent women from having an abortion, or maybe you think that taxes should be decreased, or maybe you think that our society should be a capitalist society. Maybe you're a Christian and you believe that you should worship God, or that you should read the Bible. Maybe you are a liberal and you believe that gay marriage should be allowed, or that cisgenders and transgenders should be treated equally. Whatever you believe, I assume you have a lot to say about ethical and political issues, which means that you accept many norms. Finally, think about the decisions that you make every day. Right now, you are choosing to watch this video. This means that you believe that you should watch this video, even if you didn't explicitly say that to yourself. Later, you will decide what time you should go to bed, or whether you should eat anything before going to bed, or what food you should eat, or whether you should change clothes, and so on. These everyday decisions entail that you accept many norms. For example, if later you decide to drink water, then you believe that it is permissible for you to drink water, and you probably believe that no one should prevent you from drinking water. In short, the fact that you make a lot of decisions in your life entails that you accept many norms, such as those that determine what you should do. Norms guide our decisions, so if you make a lot of decisions, then you accept many norms. Proposition 3. You should accept many norms. In other words, you should accept a set of norms that contains many norms, like at least 10 or 20, and probably a lot more. As we saw in Proposition 2, you accept many norms, and I assume that you don't have a problem with that. So, I will assume that you agree with Proposition 3. Besides, if you don't accept many norms, then it's impossible for you to make a lot of decisions and live a satisfying life. Now let's go over 7 definitions. Definition 5. Set of propositions. A set of propositions is a collection of propositions that contains at least one proposition. For instance, set of propositions 1, which contains the proposition all dogs are animals, and set of propositions 2, which contains the propositions there should be peace and water exists. Definition 6. Justification. A justification is a set of propositions that provide support for or reasons to believe a proposition. For instance, suppose that Matt Walsh tells you that abortion should be illegal because the fetus is a person. In this case, the proposition the fetus is a person is a justification, since it provides support for the proposition abortion should be illegal. Whether that support is good or bad is a different question. Definition 7. Good justification. A good justification is a justification that should cause an individual to accept or to continue to accept a proposition. For instance, suppose that Matt Walsh tells you that abortion should be illegal because the fetus is a person, and suppose that the proposition the fetus is a person should cause everyone to believe that abortion should be illegal. In this case, the proposition the fetus is a person is a good justification for the proposition abortion should be illegal. Definition 8. Bad justification. A bad justification is a justification that should not cause an individual to accept or to continue to accept a proposition. For instance, suppose that Matt Walsh tells you that abortion should be illegal because the fetus is a person, but suppose that the proposition the fetus is a person should not cause anyone to believe that abortion should be illegal. In this case, the proposition the fetus is a person is a bad justification for the proposition abortion should be illegal. Definition 9. To justify. To justify is to provide support for or reasons to believe a proposition. Whether the support is good or bad is a different question. Definition 10. Justification chain. A justification chain is a connected set of propositions linked by one or more justification relations. For instance, suppose that A justifies B and B justifies C. This is a justification chain that contains A, B, and C. The arrows are the justification relations. Here's another example. Suppose that A and B jointly justify C, and C justifies D. This is a justification chain that contains A, B, C, and D, since A and B are connected to C, and C is connected to D. Definition 11. Argument. An argument is a group of propositions, one or more of which are claimed to provide support for or reasons to believe one of the others. For instance, here's an argument. All men are humans, all humans are mortal, therefore all men are mortal. Note that this way of writing an argument is called premise-conclusion form, or standard argument form. All arguments can be written in premise-conclusion form. Now let's go over one proposition. Proposition 4. To offer a good justification for a norm, it is necessary to use at least one other norm and at least one description. To see why Proposition 4 is true, let's look at this argument. We should promote justice. For us to promote justice, it is necessary for us to legalize abortion. Therefore, we should legalize abortion. Technically, for this argument to be good, we would need to add a premise that says if we should promote justice, and for us to promote justice it is necessary for us to legalize abortion, then we should legalize abortion. But let's ignore that premise just to keep things simple. Premise 1 is a norm, since it talks about how things should be, while premise 2 is a description, since it talks about how things are. And we need both. If we remove premise 1 or premise 2, then the argument will not be good. Here's why. Suppose we remove premise 1, so we argue that we should legalize abortion because for us to promote justice, it is necessary for us to legalize abortion. That's not good enough, because if we should not promote justice, then this argument won't let us conclude that we should legalize abortion. For instance, maybe we should obey God's commands, and for us to obey God's commands, it is necessary for us to ban abortion. In that case, we should ban abortion. You see, to offer a good justification for a norm, like we should legalize abortion, we need to mention another norm, like we should promote justice. And that norm needs to be different because circular reasoning does not lead to a good justification. For instance, saying that we should legalize abortion because we should legalize abortion is not a good justification for legalizing abortion. Now let's suppose we remove premise 2. So we argue that we should legalize abortion because we should promote justice. That's not good enough either, because maybe it's possible to promote justice without legalizing abortion. We need to add premise 2. Otherwise, it would be like saying you should drink orange juice because you should satisfy your thirst. Well, you can satisfy your thirst by drinking water instead, so that's not a good argument. In the same way, pro-lifers can argue that it's possible to promote justice without legalizing abortion. To counter that, pro-choicers need to argue that that's false. So pro-choicers need to argue that premise 2 is true. For us to promote justice, it is necessary for us to legalize abortion. Thus, for this argument to be a good argument, we need premise 1, a norm, and premise 2, a description. A similar analysis applies to all normative conclusions. To offer a good justification for a norm, we will always need to use at least one other norm and at least one description. So Proposition 4 is true. Before we move on, I just want to point out that in this video series, I will probably focus on a norm justifying another norm, so I will ignore descriptions for the sake of simplicity. That's why I will probably write justification chains like this, without a description in them. This simplification will not hurt our analysis. Now let's go over the last 3 definitions. Definition 12, fundamental norm. A fundamental norm is a norm that is not justified by any norm. For example, norm 1 is a fundamental norm. Definition 13, non-fundamental norm. A non-fundamental norm is a norm that is justified by at least one norm. For example, norm 3 and norm 2 are non-fundamental norms. Definition 14, normative system. A normative system is a set of norms where at least one norm justifies a norm. For instance, here's a normative system, since norm 1 justifies norm 2. And here is an example of a more complicated normative system. Now let's finish section 2 by going over 2 propositions. Proposition 5. You accept a normative system. In other words, you accept a set of norms where at least one norm justifies a norm. It would be easier to prove this proposition if I talk to you directly, but I can't do that in a YouTube video, so I will make some general remarks instead. I assume that you have normative political beliefs. For instance, I assume that you think that abortion should be legal, or that abortion should not be legal, or that we should adopt socialism, or that we should not adopt socialism, and so on. Now, think of a political issue that you are passionate about. Maybe it's abortion, economics, immigration, freedom of speech, transgender rights, or something else. Pick any political topic that you have an opinion on. Here's a question. Why should people promote the policies that you accept? For instance, if you are pro-choice, why should people promote pro-choice policies? And if you are pro-life, why should people promote pro-life policies? Do you have a justification for your political beliefs? I assume that you do. For example, suppose you believe that abortion should be legal because women have a right to choose what to do with their bodies, and we should not violate anyone's rights. In that case, you accept a set of norms where at least one norm justifies a norm. Since the norm, we should not violate anyone's rights, justifies the norm, abortion should be legal. Meanwhile, suppose you believe that abortion should not be legal because abortion is murder, and there should be no murder. In that case, you accept a set of norms where at least one norm justifies a norm. Since the norm "there should be no murder" justifies the norm "abortion should not be legal." I just used abortion as an example. We could look at other examples together, but for the sake of saving time, I will move on to the next proposition. I'll finish by saying this. Just think about your political beliefs, and you will see that they are justified by at least one norm, like we should not violate anyone's rights, or we should treat all humans equally, or we should promote justice, or we should obey God's commands, or we should promote overall well-being, or some other norm. So, Proposition 5 is true. You accept a normative system. Proposition 6. You should accept a normative system. As we saw in Proposition 5, you accept a normative system, and I assume that you don't have a problem with that. So, I'll assume that you agree with Proposition 6. Besides, we saw in Proposition 4 that to offer a good justification for a norm, it is necessary to use at least one other norm and at least one description. So if you choose to not accept a normative system, then you will not have a good justification for any of your normative beliefs. So there you have it. We set the stage for the regress problem. Now let's talk about it. Section 3. The 3 kinds of justification chains. In this section, I will explain 2 things. First, there are foundationalist chains and non-foundationalist chains. And second, there are 2 kinds of non-foundationalist chains: infinitist chains and circular chains. After we go over this, we'll try to solve the regress problem. We already saw that you should accept a normative system. This means that you should accept a set of norms that has at least one justification relation. For instance, norm 2 justifying norm 1, or norm 2 justifying itself. For the sake of simplicity, let's just focus on norm 2 justifying norm 1. Now, regardless of whether there is one justification relation or more than one justification relation, either the justification chain ends or it doesn't. If it ends, then there is at least one fundamental norm. For instance, norm 1 is justified by norm 2, norm 2 is justified by norm 3, and norm 3 is not justified by any norm, so norm 3 is a fundamental norm. This is a foundationalist chain. A foundationalist chain is a justification chain where at least one proposition is not justified by any proposition. On the other hand, if the justification chain does not end, then there is no fundamental norm. For instance, norm 1 is justified by norm 2, norm 2 is justified by norm 3, and the chain goes on without ending. This is a non-foundationalist chain. A non-foundationalist chain is a justification chain where all propositions are justified by at least one proposition. So, either a justification chain ends or it doesn't. If it ends, then it's a foundationalist chain. If it doesn't end, then it's a non-foundationalist chain. Therefore, a justification chain is either a foundationalist chain or a non-foundationalist chain. So, a normative system has at least one foundationalist chain or at least one non-foundationalist chain, or both. Therefore, since you should accept a normative system, you need to decide whether you should accept a normative system that has at least one foundationalist chain or at least one non-foundationalist chain, or both. We'll deal with this issue in sections 4 to 6. Before we get there, we need to talk about the 2 kinds of non-foundationalist chains. There are 2 ways for a justification chain to have no fundamental norm. The first way is for there to be a linear series of non-repeating norms. For instance, norm 1 is justified by norm 2, norm 2 is justified by norm 3, and so on forever, without there being a repeated norm in the chain. This is an infinitist chain. An infinitist chain is a justification chain where all propositions are justified by at least one proposition and there is no repeating proposition. If the chain includes a repeated norm, then that's the second kind of non-foundationalist chain, where there is a circular series of repeating norms. For instance, norm 1 is justified by norm 2, norm 2 is justified by norm 3, and norm 3 is justified by norm 1, which is justified by norm 2, which is justified by norm 3, and so on without ending, since there is no fundamental norm to end this justification chain. This is a circular chain. A circular chain is a justification chain where all propositions are justified by at least one proposition and there is at least one repeating proposition. So, there are 2 ways for a justification chain to have no fundamental norm. The first way is for there to be a linear series of non-repeating norms, and the second way is for there to be a circular series of repeating norms. Note that infinitist chains and circular chains are the only two kinds of non-foundationalist chains. This is because a non-foundationalist chain has no fundamental norm, so there will be no ending in the justification process. But in a justification chain that never ends, either no norms will be repeated or at least one norm will be repeated. If no norms are repeated, then that's an infinitist chain. If at least one norm is repeated, then that's a circular chain. Those are all the options. To summarize, foundationalist chains and non-foundationalist chains are the two general kinds of justification chains. Also, there are two kinds of non-foundationalist chains: infinitist chains and circular chains. Therefore, there are three kinds of justification chains: foundationalist chains, infinitist chains, and circular chains. So, since you should accept a normative system, you need to decide whether you should accept a normative system that has at least one foundationalist chain, or at least one infinitist chain, or at least one circular chain, or a combination of these. For the rest of this video, I will argue that you should not accept a normative system that has an infinitist chain or a circular chain. Rather, you should accept a normative system that only has foundationalist chains. Section 4. Why infinitist chains fail. You should not accept a normative system that has an infinitist chain because there is no good justification for any norm in an infinitist chain, since none of the norms can determine that any norm is true, and it's impossible for you to make sure that an infinite number of norms is true. Let's start with the first reason. An infinitist chain never ends, since it has no foundation. Now, in an infinitist chain, none of the norms can determine that any norm is true because their truth value depends on the truth value of their supporting norm. For instance, suppose someone says that rich people should be taxed more because there should be financial equality, and that there should be financial equality because all humans should be treated equally. The claim that there should be financial equality can't determine that rich people should be taxed more because there should be financial equality if all humans should be treated equally. If it turns out that not all humans should be treated equally, then it has not been determined that there should be financial equality, and so it has not been determined that rich people should be taxed more. So this argument fails. A similar analysis applies to every norm in the infinitist chain. For instance, the claim that all humans should be treated equally can't determine that there should be financial equality because all humans should be treated equally if norm 4 is true. If it turns out that norm 4 is false, then it has not been determined that all humans should be treated equally, so it has not been determined that there should be financial equality, and so it has not been determined that rich people should be taxed more, so this argument fails. As Jonathan Dancy says, when we justify belief A by appeal to beliefs B and C, we have not yet shown A to be justified. We have only shown that it is justified if B and C are. Now, if someone says that a certain norm is a good justification, then the justification chain should end with that norm. For example, if someone says that the norm all humans should be treated equally is a good justification, then the justification chain should end with that norm. In this case, we should say that rich people should be taxed more because there should be financial equality, and there should be financial equality because all humans should be treated equally, period. But that is a foundationalist chain. You see, if there is no foundation in a justification chain, then there is no good justification for anything in that chain. Without a foundation, the justification is pushed back indefinitely, so we never get a decisive justification. That is, we never get a justification that can start the process of showing that a norm is true, or plausible, or warranted, or something like that. There should be a fundamental norm in a justification chain, a norm that puts an end to the question, is X permitted? If the fundamental norm says yes, then X is permitted. But if the fundamental norm says no, then X is not permitted. Therefore, you should accept a normative system that has a foundationalist chain, not an infinitist chain. Here's the second reason why infinitist chains fail. There is no good justification for any norm in an infinitist chain, since it's impossible for you to make sure that an infinite number of norms is true. An infinitist chain has an infinite number of norms, since the chain never ends and the chain has no repeated norms. Here's why that's a problem. Suppose someone says that rich people should be taxed more because there should be financial equality. This argument has a condition. Rich people should be taxed more if there should be financial equality. If it turns out that there should not be financial equality, then this argument fails. So, to make sure that this argument is good, we need to make sure that there should be financial equality. So now, suppose we say that there should be financial equality because all humans should be treated equally. This argument has a condition. There should be financial equality if all humans should be treated equally. If it turns out that not all humans should be treated equally, then this argument fails. So, to make sure that this argument is good, we need to make sure that all humans should be treated equally. So now, suppose we say that all humans should be treated equally because... Oh no, here we go again. What? You're going to use another norm to justify the claim that all humans should be treated equally. Is this ever going to end? Exactly. That's why infinitist chains fail. You see, if we need to make sure that our argument is good without there ever being an end to this process, then we will never make sure that our argument is good because all arguments have a condition. The conclusion is true if the premises are true. So you need to make sure that the premises are true before you can make sure that the argument is good. But if that process goes on forever, then you will never be able to make sure that the conclusion is true because you will never be able to make sure that all premises are true. Since there's an infinite number of premises, and it's impossible to check all of them in a finite life. To summarize, you should not accept a normative system that has an infinitist chain because there is no good justification for any norm in an infinitist chain, since none of the norms can determine that any norm is true, and it's impossible for you to make sure that an infinite number of norms is true. Section 5. Why circular chains fail. You should not accept a normative system that has a circular chain because there is no good justification for any norm in a circular chain, since none of the norms can determine that any norm is true, and a norm should not directly or indirectly justify itself. Let's start with the first reason. A circular chain never ends, since it has no foundation. So, the first thing I said in section 4 about an infinitist chain applies to a circular chain. In other words, in a circular chain, none of the norms can determine that any norm is true because their truth value depends on the truth value of their supporting norm. As I said in section 4, if there is no foundation in a justification chain, then there is no good justification for anything in that chain. Therefore, you should accept a normative system that has a foundationalist chain, not a circular chain. Here's the second reason why circular chains fail. There is no good justification for any norm in a circular chain, since a norm should not directly or indirectly justify itself. A circular chain has repeated norms, which means that the norms in it directly or indirectly justify themselves. But that's problematic because it's circular reasoning, which is illogical. For instance, suppose that someone says that you should obey the law because the government tells you to obey the law, and you should obey the government because the law tells you to obey the government. That's illogical and unconvincing. That's saying that you should obey the law because you should obey the government, and you should obey the government because you should obey the law, and so on forever. Circular reasoning should never be convincing to anyone, and it doesn't matter how large the circle is. Whether it's like this, or like this, or like this. To summarize, you should not accept a normative system that has a circular chain because there is no good justification for any norm in a circular chain, since none of the norms can determine that any norm is true, and the norm should not directly or indirectly justify itself. Section 6. You should accept a foundationalist chain. In Section 2, I showed that you should accept a normative system. In Section 3, I argued that there are three kinds of justification chains: foundationalist chains, infinitist chains, and circular chains. And in Sections 4 and 5, I explained why you should not accept a normative system that has an infinitist chain or a circular chain. So, by process of elimination, it follows that you should accept a normative system that only has foundationalist chains. In other words, you should accept a normative system that has at least one foundationalist chain and 0 non-foundationalist chains. This means that you should accept a normative system that has at least one fundamental norm. So, the next question is this: which norms should you accept as fundamental norms? In other words, what should be the fundamental norms of your normative system? I think this is the most important problem in politics and ethics. We'll talk about it in the next video. Before I wrap things up, I will answer two objections. Here's the first one. Perhaps someone may say that they are not fully convinced by what I said in this video because my argument for accepting foundationalist chains is only an argument by process of elimination, and I haven't really answered the question: if the justification chain should end at some point, then why should it end there instead of elsewhere? Here's my reply. An argument by process of elimination is a valid argument, so the objection doesn't refute my argument. Disjunctive syllogisms are valid even though they involve process of elimination. So, To refute my argument, someone needs to refute what I said in sections 4 and 5. For example, someone needs to show that a norm in an infinitist or circular chain can determine that a norm is true. Also, I have an answer to the question if the justification chain should end at some point, then why should it end there instead of elsewhere? I didn't include my answer in this video because it's not necessary. I'm trying to go step by step, and the purpose of this video is just to argue that you should accept a normative system that only has foundationalist chains. Later in this series, I will explain what our fundamental norms should be, so I will answer that question. Here's the second objection. Perhaps someone may say that they are not fully convinced by what I said in this video because I didn't explicitly talk about coherentism, which says that if norm 1 is coherent with certain norms, then norm 1 is well justified. For instance, a coherentist would say that you are permitted or even obligated to believe that we should not steal because such norm coheres with the norms we should promote justice and we should be kind to others. In other words, a coherentist would say that you are permitted or even obligated to accept norm 1 because it coheres with set of norms 2, which consists of norm 2 and norm 3. Here's my reply. I would ask a coherentist the following question. Why should I accept norm 1? They would say, because you should accept norms that cohere with set of norms 2, and norm 1 coheres with set of norms 2. Here's the coherentist's argument. Here's my next question to the coherentist. Why should I accept norms that cohere with set of norms 2? In other words, why should I accept premise 1? Premise 1 is a norm, so I'm asking why I should accept such norm. And keep in mind that for a coherentist to offer a good justification for premise 1, they will have to use at least one other norm, since to offer a good justification for a norm, it is necessary to use at least one other norm and at least one description. Now, the coherentist can say that premise 1 is not justified by any norm, but then premise 1 is a fundamental norm, so the coherentist accepts a foundationalist chain. On the other hand, the coherentist can say that premise 1 is justified by at least one norm. But then I would ask, why should I accept the norm that justifies premise 1? In this case, why should I accept norm 4? If this justification chain stops at some point, then it's a foundationalist chain. But if it never stops, then it's either an infinitist chain or a circular chain, and I already criticized those chains in sections 4 and 5. You see, there is no additional option, and coherentism does not escape these options. There's one last thing. A coherentist might push back and say that norm 1 is not justified by a linear chain extending backward. Rather, norm 1 is justified because it's part of a coherent normative system, or a coherent normative web. Okay, but why that normative system, or that normative web? Why not a different normative system, or a different normative web? In other words, instead of accepting norms that cohere with set of norms 2, why shouldn't people accept norms that cohere with set of norms 3? That's what I'm asking. We could accept the norms we should not steal, we should promote justice, and we should be kind to others. And these norms explain each other and are logically and probabilistically consistent, so these norms cohere with one another. But why not accept the norms we should steal, we should promote injustice, and we should be mean to others, when these norms also explain each other and are logically and probabilistically consistent, so these norms also cohere with one another? Coherentism does not adequately resolve this issue. Coherence is important for determining which normative systems we should not accept. For example, if a normative system is logically inconsistent, then we should not accept it. But just because a normative system is coherent does not mean that we should accept it. Section 7. Conclusion. In this video, we looked at the regress problem, and I argued that we should accept a normative system that only has foundationalist chains. What do you think? Is this the best solution to the regress problem? Leave a comment below if you have any thoughts, criticisms, or suggestions. Thank you for watching, and in the next video we'll look at the normative foundation problem, which I think is the most important problem in politics and ethics. I hope to see you there.